First off, I just want to say real quick that no, you're not hallucinating. I did change my name from Triforce Truths. If you were subscribed to me before, I apologize for the confusion, and if you're new to the channel, you can just ignore this. Anyways, when I made my channel, I wasn't thorough enough in making sure I didn't accidentally use something too similar to someone's name, and so I ended up having an incredibly similar name to the wonderful Triforce Trends, who you should also totally subscribe to. I felt kinda bad about this, and there have been a couple of mix-ups and name confusion, so I felt the best choice was to slightly rebrand to clear everything up. That's all I wanted to say, so now, onto the video. Breath of the Wild has a lot of fascinating aspects and characters, but in my opinion, nothing quite matches the majesty of the dragons. These creatures, known as Naedra, Farosh, and Dinral, roam around the Lanayru, Faron, and Eldin regions respectively. There is nothing quite like roaming around Hyrule and stumbling onto one of them. Even having played the game for as long as I have, I'm still amazed whenever I see one. If you follow them for long enough, they eventually fly high into the sky and open up a portal. One thing that is really cool about these dragons is that they're really mysterious and we don't know much about them. Other than the fact that a couple of NPCs mention they might exist but nobody can see them, not much about them is mentioned in the game. So today, I decided I would like to take a dive into this topic and see what we can learn about the dragons. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Alright, so before we start theorizing, let's cover what we know about the dragons so far. We know that they're spirits and aren't really dragons. For example, according to the Hyrule Compendium, Naedra is a spirit of ice taking form of this giant dragon. We also know that they're able to disappear into the clouds, although to where, we don't know, at least not yet. According to one of the NPCs of the game, one must have the blessing of Hylia to see the dragons, likely why Link can see them and others can't. That's not a lot of information to go off of, but it's basically all the info we are given. Like I said, they are very mysterious creatures. The first thing I would like to tackle is where the dragons go when they enter the portals. Now, this isn't the first game where we've seen portals in the sky. If we go all the way back in the timeline, back to Skyward Sword, we also see 3 portals. Interestingly, these portals take Link to the Eldin, Lanayru, and Faron regions. As I was thinking about this, I realized something. Now, there is obviously the massive cloud barrier below Skyloft that prevents the people of Skyloft from going down to the surface. However, once Link travels below to the surface, the cloud layer disappears and it's sunny. Despite this, Skyloft is nowhere to be seen when on the surface, meaning that the cloud barrier both prevents the surface from seeing Skyloft and prevents Skyloft from seeing the surface. Unfortunately, when returning to Skyloft, the screen blanks out before we can see how Link travels above the clouds, so you aren't sure how that happens, but it seems safe to assume it's similar to how he descends. With all of that said, it seems highly likely that Skyloft is where these dragons are going. The end of Skyward Sword never mentions that Skyloft was destroyed, or even that all of the members of Skyloft left for the surface. Skyloft seems to be Hylia's sacred realm of sorts, considering she created the place, has her silent realm there, and has a sacred statue in the Thunderhead. Since the dragons are spirits named after the 3 golden goddesses that created the Triforce, it makes sense that they would want to spend their time up there when not roaming throughout Hyrule. So that's my take on where the dragons go when they leave Hyrule. Maybe I just missed something in the many Zelda videos I've watched, but I'm honestly surprised I haven't seen this mentioned at all. Alright, so we have a theory for where the dragons go, but now for the hard part. Who are the dragons? Well, let's look at what we know that could help us. Like I said before, we know that the dragons are actually spirits taking the form of dragons. We also know that they are related to Hylia in some way, as one of Breath of the Wild's NPCs says they can only be seen by those with Hylia's blessing. So now, let's take a look at some of the characters we've seen before in the games that could be different reincarnations of the spirits. The most obvious choice is the dragons from Skyward Sword. However, I don't believe these to be the same. First off, while these dragons are connected to the goddess Hylia, they don't seem to be spirits. Rather, they seem to be actual flesh and bone creatures, able to die and get wounded, indicated by Lanayru and Faron. I know Naedra gets infected by the malice in Breath of the Wild, and while that could be considered the same thing, I don't think so, because the malice is evil. It doesn't act like a disease or wound, but more of a barrier, hampering down Naedra and preventing her from moving. Not only this, but the dragons from Breath of the Wild are incapable of being injured. You can shoot them with ancient arrows or bomb arrows, and they don't even budge. The only thing capable of containing them is malice. Now, in my opinion, the more likely option for this is the light spirits from Twilight Princess. First off, their name explicitly states that they are spirits, which fits perfectly in with the dragons. Second, according to one of the NPCs from the game, they're only visible to the brave. which is very similar to how one of the NPCs states that they are only visible to those with Hylia's blessing. What about Ordona, the light spirit from the region of the same name? Well, since Ordona is not technically in Hyrule, it wouldn't make sense that Ordona would be in Breath of the Wild. Not only this, but when talking to Lanayru, the spirit mentions that the Golden Goddesses told the spirits besides Ordona to protect Hyrule and stop the interlopers, so it's clear that Ordona isn't nearly as important to Hyrule as the others. More evidence towards this is shown by looking at the dragon's powers. Looking back again at Skyward Sword, we can see that Lanayru is the one with electricity and that Farron is the one with water powers. However, in Breath of the Wild, those roles are reversed. This is likely because of the transition from the old Lanayru region becoming Gerudo Desert. Why this happened is unknown, although my personal theory that lacks any evidence is that Groose moved there and renamed it to Groosland, which is why all the Gerudo are redheads and the name similarity between Gerudo and Groose. Like I said though, there's basically no evidence for this. Anyways, the Lanayru region has shifted throughout the timeline, eventually ending up to the north of Farron. As the region shifted, so did the terrain. Lanayru went from being a desert to being a forested and wet landscape. It became the home of the Zora, likely why the spirit became a spirit of water and ice. Farron received a much more mild change, going from just an ordinary forest to a much more tropical one, and with tropical weather comes tropical storms, as we can see by the constant thunderstorms of this region. Obviously, Eldin remains the same, as the Eldin region has remained the same throughout the series thanks to the massive volcano. So basically, what this boils down to is climate change and relocation, at least in my opinion. I don't think there's any major reason for it, other than the fact that over the course of tens of thousands of years, things change and terrain begins to differ. By the time of Twilight Princess, the Lanayru region was a much more watery area, similar to Breath of the Wild. Thus, as the light spirits reincarnated as the dragons we see in Breath of the Wild, they based their element off the terrain around them. Since that terrain hadn't differed between Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild, it makes much more sense that the light spirits, who were already familiar with the terrain of the areas they guarded, would incarnate into the dragons, rather than the dragons from Skyward Sword, who already had elements fitting to the terrain during their lives. And well, that's all the stuff I wanted to cover about the dragons. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. The script was a lot of fun to write, as it covered a lot of stuff from Skyward Sword, which, you'll know if you follow my Twitter, is my favorite Zelda game. Speaking of which, you should totally check out my Twitter and Instagram accounts, which will both be linked below. If you liked the video, be sure to like and subscribe, and if you have any questions or ideas about the dragons, then be sure to comment them down below. Anyways, that's all I have for you guys today, so until next time, I'm now Truth Force, and I'm out.